In this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the major turning points of the Second World War, some of the major battles that happened. In 1942, a series of events occurred that changed the tide of war in favor of the Allied powers. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. began an island hopping campaign to strike back against Japan. General Douglas MacArthur led the ground troops, while Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the naval forces. Early in summer 1942, the Japanese set up a plan to draw in American ships to the island of Midway and ambush them there. The U.S., however, had decoded secret messages that revealed the Japanese plans. The U.S. decided to set up an ambush of its own. Admiral Nimitz would have his carriers ready and waiting at Midway for the Japanese. Though both sides sustained heavy losses in the ensuing battle, Japan suffered far more than the U.S., losing 4 aircraft carriers. After this decisive U.S. Navy victory, the remainder of the Japanese fleet had to retreat. The United States had claimed the offensive and began to act more aggressively to secure island after island in the Pacific. Going island to island in the Pacific is how it got the name island hopping. That's the strategy the U.S. used in the Pacific against the Japanese. Let's talk about what's going on in Russia with Germans and in the U.S. Soviet Union. Hitler ordered his troops to attack Stalingrad. That's in the Soviet Union in August 1942. Through intensive house-to-house fighting, the Germans slowly occupied most of the city. In November, the Soviets counterattacked and surrounded the German army. As supplies ran low and the harsh Russian winter set in, the German army suffered a slow attrition. Little by bit, they were dying away, losing thousands of troops to the cold and to starvation. Running out of ammunition, the Germans were forced to surrender in January 1943. The human toll of this siege was enormous. An estimated 500,000 Soviets died, along with 150,000 Germans. The battle marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Just as in the Pacific, the Axis armies were on the defensive. The Soviet troops pushed them back toward Germany. This Battle of Stalingrad was very significant in world history because it is the largest battle, the most casualties out of any battle ever in human history. Let's hope ever again. This is a world war, so let's go over to the continent of Africa now. In 1940, Mussolini had ordered his North African army to move against the British in Egypt. Egypt was a British colony at the time. After the initial success, the Italians were forced back by an attacking British army. The goal here was to take the Suez Canal. You can see in the map where that's located as key for trade and moving sources. So if the British had lost this, it would have been a major loss. But the British, they did not lose it. They did not lose the canal, and once again, the Axis were put on the defensive. The Italians were routed. In response, Hitler sent General Erwin Rommel to command the new Tank Corps and take Egypt from the British. It's all about that canal. They need to have that canal. On November 4th, 1942, after months of back and forth fighting, the British army stopped the Germans at El Alamein in Egypt. By March 1943, the Allies had North Africa under their control and began to plan for the invasion of Sicily. That's part of Italy. So now that Africa is under control of the British, it's time to start taking the fight to Europe. The goal was to regain control of much of the Mediterranean and to force Hitler to redirect a large number of his troops to the Western Front, thus easing the fighting on the Eastern Front for the Soviets. Basing their operations in North Africa, the Allies invaded and captured Sicily in the summer of 1943, forcing Mussolini out of power. Italy gets knocked out. All that's left is Hitler and Japan, and they're on the defensive. 1943, Mussolini was removed from office by the Fascist Grand Council. He was imprisoned, but Hitler had him rescued and set him up as head of an Italian government in German-occupied northern Italy. On June 4th, 1944, the Allies entered Rome. They continued to push north and gained control of all of Italy by 1945. While attempting to escape to Switzerland, Mussolini was captured by partisans and executed. With the Soviet victory almost certain in the east and Italy's surrender in the west, the Allies began to prepare for an invasion of France. Remember, France was under the control of Germany. They hoped that once they had secured France, they could push forward into Germany from two fronts, the Russian side and the French side, at the same time. The Allies carefully planned the invasion of Europe, the invasion of France. The Germans suspected an invasion was imminent, so they heavily fortified the entire French coast because they did not know where the invasion would take place. On June 6, 1944, combined British and American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. That's northern France. In what would be the greatest naval invasion in history. And that's true. This is the largest amphibious assault in history. Within 100 days, more than 2 million troops and 500,000 vehicles were making their way inland. By late July, the Allies, led by George Patton, had pushed past the German defenses. Operation Overlord, as the invasion was called, was successful. At the estimated cost of 10,000 Allied troops, German losses have been estimated between 4,000 to 9,000. The D in D-Day has really no significance. It simply refers to day, as in the first day of that particular operation. Late August 1944, the Allies entered Paris. D-Day was a success. The amphibious assault into France, and Paris was recaptured by the Allies. By September, they had successfully liberated all of France. The photograph in this slide shows American troops in a tank passing the Arc de Triomphe after the liberation of Paris. They're in Paris, rolling around. The Allies next turned their attention to invading Germany. The British and American troops pushed in from the west, and the Soviet army advanced from the east. In December 1944, the Germans launched a last-ditch counterattack to try to split the Allied forces. The German offensive, which took place in the Ardennes forest, southern Belgium, created a bulge in the Allies' lines. The battle thus quickly became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 1 million soldiers fought in this battle, making it the largest land battle of the war. The fighting lasted over a month, and in the end, the Germans were forced to retreat. The caption for the picture on the right side of this reads, quote, "We were getting our second wind now and started flattening out that bulge. We took 50,000 prisoners in December alone." That's from the U.S. National Archives. As the Allies pushed to end the war in Europe, U.S. and British planes began to bomb communication centers in eastern Germany in order to aid the Soviet advance on Berlin. Dozens of cities were destroyed as a result, including the German city of Dresden, an event which remains controversial to this day. You see, Dresden was a cultural center that had no significant military or industrial areas. It was renowned for the fine china that had been produced there for hundreds of years. Over the course of 3 days in February 1945, the British Air Force and then the U.S. Air Force dropped load after load of bombs on Dresden. starting a firestorm that quickly engulfed the city and the people. They all burned alive. When the flames finally died down, there was virtually nothing left. Statistics show that of 28,410 houses in the inner city, 24,800 were destroyed. Almost all of them. Estimates of the number killed range from 25,000 to 135,000. A 9-year-old survivor of the bombing described the hellishness of this experience. Here's the first-hand account, our primary document from this 9-year-old. We saw terrible things. Cremated adults shrunk to the size of small children, pieces of arms and legs, dead people, whole families burnt to death, burning people ran to and fro, burnt couches filled with civilian refugees, dead rescuers and soldiers. Many were calling and looking for their children and families, and fire everywhere, everywhere fire. And all the time, the hot wind of the firestorm threw people back into the burning houses they were trying to escape from. End quote. People still argue over the necessity of the bombing. Some have claimed it was militarily unnecessary because at the time, Soviet forces were less than 20 miles away from the city to the east, while U.S. troops were some 40 miles to the west. Others have even gone so far to characterize the bombing of Dresden as a war crime. These were civilians, killed for no real reason. Those who defend the bombing have asserted that it was hardly unprecedented or unprovoked, since German planes and rockets had killed thousands of civilians in England alone. They also note that Dresden acted as a rail base for facilitating the transport of German soldiers to the Eastern Front. By March 1945, it had become clear that Germany would soon be in the Allied hands. Facing certain defeat, Hitler took his own life in April of that year. With Hitler dead and the city of Berlin surrounded, the Nazis surrendered on May 7th, 1945, to General Dwight Eisenhower. VE, Victory over Europe Day. So, on May 8, 1945, the Allied powers celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Tom Felcher, a civilian living in England at the time, describes VE Day, another primary document. On the 7th May 1945, Germany surrendered, and in the 8th May was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe. The whole world seemed to go crazy in dancing, singing, and parties in the street, and celebration drinks. As a group of maturing teenagers, we planned a pub crawl that evening, and off we went to the center of Bristol. Although the dancing, singing, bonfires, and kissing and hugging of complete strangers carried on, unfortunately the pubs ran out of beer. By about 9:30 p.m., every pub was dry, cleared out of anything drinkable, but the fun continued dancing around the bonfires. With the war over in Europe, the Allies looked to quickly end the fighting in the Pacific against the Japanese. By the fall of 1944, Allied forces had Japan in retreat. Led by Douglas MacArthur, the Allies took back control of the Philippines in spring 1945. As the war continued to go against them, the Japanese took to extreme measures to try and slow the Allied advance. One such measure involved the use of kamikaze aircraft, or flying suicide missions in which planes loaded with explosives flew directly into ships with the pilot. It is estimated that as many as 5,000 kamikaze fighters killed themselves by dive bombing into Allied aircraft, and more than 5,000 Allied naval personnel died as a result. Ultimately, however, the kamikaze missions could not stop Allies from moving closer and closer to Japan. In spring 1945, U.S. Marines gained control of the islands of Iwo Jima In Okinawa, you see in the picture them taking the island, raising the flag. In the pivotal battle over Iwo Jima, more than 100,000 U.S. troops fought to take the island from a heavily entrenched and fortified Japanese force of 25,000. Though the Americans suffered almost 25,000 casualties, nearly all the Japanese soldiers died. Okinawa, which lay less than 400 miles from Japan, involved even more combatants. Nearly 100,000 Japanese defended that island against 180,000 U.S. troops. After 3 months, the U.S. finally took Okinawa at the cost of almost 50,000 casualties. The Japanese suffered staggering losses, with only 7,000 or so soldiers remaining to surrender to the Americans. The Allies now could use Okinawa as a staging ground for a land invasion of Japan. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated Japan's fight to the death attitude and unwillingness to surrender. They will fight to the last person, no matter the cost. The Allies knew that using ground troops to subdue Japan, the island, would be difficult and result in a huge number of casualties. Some estimated that nearly 1 million Allied soldiers would die in the operation. But there was an alternative. Prior to the beginning of the war, President Roosevelt had approved a program called the Manhattan Project that had the goal of building an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project built the atomic bomb. Top scientists from around the world, including refugees from Germany, even Einstein, worked to complete the bomb before Germans could. On June 16, 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb took place in the desert of New Mexico. Truman, who took over the war after Eisenhower died, chose to use the weapon against the Japanese in order to bring a quick end to the war and avoid the casualties of the U.S. Of a ground assault. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 2 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. This is what was left of Hiroshima. The picture in this slide shows the city of Hiroshima after the dropping of the bomb. It destroyed 90% of the city. When the bomb exploded, the temperature at ground zero rose to 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The blast killed 70,000 people instantly. An additional 70,000 were dead by the new year from burns, radiation, or other injuries. Nearly all the victims of this attack were civilians. The atomic bombs finally forced Japan to capitulate, to give up. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Battleship Missouri. Within 2 weeks of the Japanese Emperor's surrender, U.S. troops under the command of MacArthur had occupied the island of Japan. World War II was officially over. Your questions for Google form.